Millionaire discovers waitress protecting his disabled black twins from cruel stepmother. What happens next is shocking. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the marble hallway of the Palmer mansion, followed by a child's muffled sob. 7-year-old Amelia Palmer pressed her small body against the cold wall, her hearing aids amplifying every cruel word that sliced through the air like daggers. "You clumsy little mistake." Victoria Palmer's voice dripped with venom as she towered over the trembling girl. "Look what you've done in my crystal vase. Your father may have married me, but that doesn't make you anything more than a burden I have to tolerate. Hello, beautiful souls. I hope you're having an incredible day, wherever in the world you're watching from. I'm so grateful you've joined me for another story that will touch your heart and remind you why love always wins. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. Your support means everything to me, and I promise you won't want to miss the stories we share here. Today's story will take you on an emotional journey that proves sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the darkest places. It's about a waitress named Sarah Washington, whose own painful past prepared her for the most important moment of her life, when she discovered 2 innocent children living in fear behind the golden doors of wealth and privilege. Amelia's twin brother, Michael, sat silently in his wheelchair nearby, his cerebral palsy making it impossible for him to speak clearly, but his dark eyes, so much like their late mother's, burned with helpless rage. The 8-year-old boy watched his sister sink to her knees, carefully picking up glass shards with shaking hands while their stepmother Victoria circled them like a predator. "Your mother should have lived to clean up after you herself," Victoria hissed, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against the marble banister. "But since she was too weak to survive bringing you into this world, I suppose I'm stuck with the consequences of her failure." The twins had learned long ago not to tell their father about these moments. Victoria was an actress. The moment they heard his Bentley in the driveway, she would transform. Her face would soften, her voice would become honey-sweet, and she would rush to help the children she had just finished tormenting. Richard Palmer, still drowning in grief 3 years after losing his beloved wife Claudia, never suspected that the woman he'd married to give his children a mother was slowly destroying them from within. But on this humid Thursday evening in Atlanta, someone else was watching. Sarah Washington had arrived early for her evening shift at Palmer Industries' private dining room, where she served meals during the company's late board meetings. At 28, Sarah carried herself with quiet dignity despite the scars that crisscrossed her back, reminders of her adoptive mother's belt when she was caught acting too black as a child. The Hendersons had adopted her when she was 5, not out of love, but to fulfill a court-mandated community service requirement. For 13 years, they had reminded her daily that she should be grateful for their charity, even as they worked to erase every trace of her identity and culture. Sarah had discovered the service entrance near the family wing of the mansion purely by accident. But as she heard Victoria's voice rising in anger, something in her chest tightened with recognition. She knew that tone, the careful modulation of someone who had perfected cruelty behind closed doors. Peering through the slightly open door, Sarah's breath caught her throat as she witnessed Victoria grab Amelia's thin arm, her grip leaving white marks on the child's brown skin. "Maybe if you spent less time pretending to be normal and more time being grateful, you wouldn't be such a disappointment," Victoria snarled. "Your father works 16-hour days to keep you fed and clothed, and this is how you repay him? By breaking my things." Michael's wheelchair creaked as he tried to roll closer to his sister, his limited mobility making the simple movement a struggle. Victoria's cold laugh filled the air as she noticed his effort. "Oh, how sweet. The cripple wants to play hero." She positioned herself between the siblings, her designer heels clicking against the marble. "You can't even speak properly, Michael. What exactly do you think you're going to do?" That's when Sarah made a decision that would change 3 lives forever. She couldn't stand by and watch another child suffer the kind of systematic cruelty she had endured. Not when she had the power to intervene. The door opened with a soft click, and Victoria whirled around, her expression instantly shifting to one of polished surprise as she spotted Sarah in her crisp black serving uniform. "Oh, I didn't realize anyone was here yet." Victoria's voice transformed completely, becoming warm and maternal as she smoothed down her blonde hair. "I was just helping the children clean up a little accident. You know how it is with kids, always getting into mischief." But Sarah's trained eye caught what Victoria missed. The way Amelia flinched when her stepmother moved, the protective way Michael's hands gripped his wheelchair armrests, and most telling of all, the immediate relief that flooded both children's faces at the sight of another adult. Sarah had become an expert at reading the language of hidden abuse. She recognized the signs because she had lived them. "I'm Sarah," she said gently, kneeling down to meet Amelia's eyes while keeping Victoria in her peripheral vision. "Are you hurt, sweetheart?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria's smile never wavered, but Sarah caught the flash of warning in her green eyes, a look that clearly said, "Mind your own business." But Sarah Washington had spent too many years being silenced by people who wielded power over the powerless. Not anymore. Not today. And as she looked into Michael and Amelia Palmer's frightened eyes, she knew she was about to make an enemy of one of Atlanta's most influential women. The question was, would she be brave enough to see it through when the real battle began? Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she maintained eye contact with Amelia, whose dark eyes reminded her painfully of her own younger self. Terrified, isolated, and desperately hoping someone, anyone, would see her suffering and care enough to act. "I'm fine," Amelia whispered, the practiced response of a child who had learned that honesty only brought more pain. Her small hands still clutched fragments of the crystal vase, a thin line of blood visible where a sharp edge had nicked her palm. "Let me help you with that," Sarah said softly, pulling a clean napkin from her apron pocket. She noticed how Amelia instinctively pulled back when Sarah reached for her hand, another red flag that made Sarah's stomach clench with recognition. Victoria watched this interaction with the predatory stillness of someone calculating their next move. At 35, she had perfected the art of manipulation, her beauty serving as both weapon and shield. She had married Richard Palmer not for love, but for access to his fortune and social status. The children were obstacles she hadn't anticipated, living reminders of the woman who had possessed Richard's heart in a way Victoria never could. "Sarah, wasn't it?" Victoria's voice carried a subtle edge of authority. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm perfectly capable of caring for my children." "My children?" The possessive claim made Michael's jaw tighten visibly. At 8 years old, he might struggle with speech due to his cerebral palsy, but his mind was sharp as a blade. He understood every nuance of Victoria's cruelty, every calculated move in her campaign to make them disappear from their father's attention. "Of course, Mrs. Palmer," Sarah replied evenly, but she didn't step away from the children. Instead, she continued gently cleaning Amelia's cut while speaking in the warm, steady tone she wished someone had used with her during her darkest moments. "Accidents happen. No harm done." The simple kindness in Sarah's voice made Amelia's eyes well with tears she had trained herself not to shed. When was the last time an adult had spoken to her without disappointment, anger, or barely concealed resentment? Her memories of her mother Claudia were fading, replaced by Victoria's constant reminders that she and Michael were burdens their father tolerated out of obligation. Michael cleared his throat, a sound that always took tremendous effort, and managed to form words through his motor difficulties. "Thank." The gratitude in his young voice cut straight through Sarah's professional composure. She remembered Michael's age, watching her adoptive mother Martha Henderson's face twist with disgust whenever Sarah's natural hair texture showed through the harsh chemical relaxers, or when Sarah's skin looked too dark next to the Henderson family photos. "Your hair is so beautiful," Sarah whispered to Amelia as she finished tending to the cut. "It reminds me of my mother's hair when I was little. She used to say our curls were like little springs of joy." Amelia's hand moved unconsciously to touch her tightly braided hair, another of Victoria's control tactics. The woman insisted on managing the children's appearance herself, always pulling Amelia's hair back so severely it gave her headaches, claiming it looked neater and more appropriate for a Palmer. Victoria's composure cracked slightly at Sarah's comment. "I think that's quite enough," she said, her tone sharpening. "I'm sure you have work to prepare for. Mr. Palmer expects perfection from his staff." But Sarah had spent years working in high-end establishments, serving Atlanta's elite. She recognized the difference between legitimate authority and the desperate grasping of someone who had never earned real power. Victoria's threat felt hollow because it was rooted in fear rather than strength. "Actually," Sarah said, standing slowly but keeping her voice respectful. "I arrived early specifically to make sure everything was perfect for tonight's board meeting. Mr. Palmer values attention to detail." She paused, meeting Victoria's gaze steadily. "And he values the well-being of everyone in his household." The subtle implication wasn't lost on Victoria, whose green eyes flashed with anger. But before she could respond, the sound of a car, door slamming, echoed from the front driveway. "Daddy!" Amelia's face transformed with genuine joy, the first real emotion Sarah had seen from her since arriving. Victoria's entire demeanor shifted like a switch being flipped. Her shoulders relaxed, her smile became warm and maternal, and she moved to help Michael position his wheelchair for their father's arrival. "Come on, sweetheart," Victoria cooed to Amelia, her voice dripping with fake affection. "Let's go and welcome Daddy home. And remember what we talked about. He works so hard for us. We don't want to worry him with silly little accidents, do we?" Sarah watched this performance with growing disgust and recognition. This was exactly how Martha Henderson had operated, cruel and controlling in private, but ready to play the devoted mother the moment anyone else was watching. The psychological manipulation was textbook. Make the children complicit in their own abuse by forcing them to hide it. Richard Palmer's voice echoed through the marble foyer as he called out to his children. Sarah had seen him during previous catering events, a tall, distinguished man in his early 40s whose success in the tech industry had made him one of Atlanta's most eligible bachelors after his wife's death. He had the kind of gentle eyes that suggested he'd been a loving father before grief had made him emotionally unavailable. As the family disappeared toward the front of the house, Sarah remained in the hallway, her mind racing. She thought about her own father, her biological father, who had loved her completely for the first 5 years of her life before a drunk driver stole him away. She remembered how safe she had felt in his arms, how he called her "my little princess," and meant it with every fiber of his being. These children deserved that same unconditional love and protection. And Sarah was beginning to realize that she might be the only person in position to ensure they received it. But challenging Victoria Palmer wouldn't be like standing up to Martha Henderson, who had been a small-town nobody with delusions of grandeur. Victoria moved in circles of real power and influence. She had resources, connections, and most dangerous of all, she had learned exactly how to present herself as the perfect stepmother while systematically destroying the children in her care. Sarah pulled out her phone and made a decision that would either save 2 innocent lives or destroy her own carefully rebuilt existence. She opened her camera app and began taking photos of the crystal shards still scattered across the marble floor, the small bloodstain where Amelia had been kneeling, and most importantly, the finger-shaped bruises already darkening on the little girl's arm. Because Sarah Washington had learned one crucial lesson from her own childhood trauma. Silence protected abusers, not victims. And she would not be silent again. The question now was whether she could gather enough evidence before Victoria realized she was being watched, and whether Richard Palmer would choose to see the truth when it was finally presented to him, or if his guilt and grief would make him another unwitting accomplice in his children's suffering. One thing was certain: the battle lines had been drawn, and Sarah was preparing for war. 3 weeks passed before Sarah witnessed the moment that would shatter Richard Palmer's carefully constructed world. She had been strategically arriving early to her shifts, documenting Victoria's cruelty with the methodical precision of someone building a legal case. Photos of bruises, audio recordings of verbal abuse, detailed notes of every incident, all stored safely in a cloud account Victoria couldn't access. But nothing could have prepared her for what she discovered on that rainy Thursday evening in October. Sarah had entered through the service door as usual, expecting to find the family wing empty since Richard was supposed to be in Chicago for a conference. Instead, she heard Michael's distinctive struggle to form words, punctuated by what sounded like crying. Following the sound down the marble hallway, Sarah found herself outside Michael's bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and what she saw through the gap made her blood freeze. Victoria stood over Michael, who was lying on his bed in obvious distress, his usual medications scattered across the nightstand. In her hand, Victoria held the small device that helped regulate Michael's muscle spasms, and she was deliberately keeping it out of his reach. "Please," Michael managed to whisper, his body contorting as another wave of spasms hit. Hurts so bad. Maybe this will teach you not to spill juice on my white sofa, Victoria said coldly. Your clumsiness has consequences, Michael. If you can't control your body like a normal child, then maybe you don't deserve the things that help you. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her phone, but before she could start recording, she heard something that made her heart stop. The distinctive sound of Richard's Bentley pulling into the driveway. He was home early. Victoria heard it too. Her head snapped toward the window, and Sarah watched the woman's face cycle through panic, calculation, and finally, cold determination. Listen to me very carefully, Michael, Victoria hissed, leaning close to the suffering child. Your father is home. If you tell him about this, about any of this, I will make sure you never see your precious sister again. Do you understand me? There are special schools for children like you, very far away from here. Michael's eyes went wide with terror. Sarah knew that threat would work. These children would endure any suffering to protect each other. But as Victoria straightened up and began her usual transformation routine, something unexpected happened. Michael's bedroom door, weakened by the old house's settling, creaked fully open, and Richard Palmer, who had quietly entered through the front door hoping to surprise his children, stood at the end of the hallway with a direct view into his son's room. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Richard took in the scene, his son writhing in pain on the bed, his wife holding Michael's medical device, and the tears streaming down his little boy's face. What's going on here? Richard's voice was quiet, but Sarah recognized the dangerous calm of a parent's protective instincts awakening. Victoria's performance kicked into overdrive. Oh, Richard, you're home early. What a wonderful surprise. She quickly moved to help Michael sit up, her voice becoming saccharine with concern. Michael was having some muscle spasms, and I was just about to give him his device. You know how he gets embarrassed about his condition. He asked me not to help him right away because he wanted to try managing on his own first. Isn't that right, sweetheart? Sarah watched Michael's face crumple as he realized the impossible position Victoria had put him in. Agree with her lie and endure more abuse in silence. Or tell the truth and risk losing Amelia forever. That's when Sarah made the decision that would change everything. She stepped out of the shadows and into the hallway, her phone already recording. Excuse me, Mr. Palmer, she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. I apologize for interrupting, but I think you need to see something. Richard turned, recognizing her as the catering staff member who had been working his evening meetings. Sarah, isn't it? What are you doing in this part of the house? Victoria's eyes flashed with fury, but she couldn't abandon her maternal performance with Richard watching. I'm sure Sarah just got turned around looking for the kitchen, she said through gritted teeth. The staff quarters are in the opposite direction, dear. Actually, Sarah said, her thumb hovering over the play button on a video she had recorded 2 weeks earlier. I've been documenting some concerning incidents involving your children's care. I believe you have a right to know what happens in your home when you're not here. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. Victoria's mask finally slipped, revealing the calculating predator beneath. How dare you? Victoria snarled, abandoning all pretense. You're nothing but hired help. You have no right to interfere in private family matters. Actually, Richard said quietly, his businessman's instincts recognizing the gravity of the situation. I think I need to hear what Sarah has to say. Sarah looked at Michael, who was staring at her with a mixture of hope and terror. She thought about her own 8-year-old self, praying someone would be brave enough to speak up for her. Your son was suffering from muscle spasms, Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. Mrs. Palmer was deliberately withholding his medical device as punishment for accidentally spilling juice. She threatened to send him away if he told you the truth. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, denial, and finally, a dawning horror as he looked at his son and saw the truth written in the boy's frightened eyes. Michael, Richard said gently, kneeling beside his son's bed. Is that what happened? Michael looked between his father and Victoria, tears streaming down his face. In that moment, he made the bravest decision of his young life. Yes, he whispered. Victoria's composure shattered completely. He's lying. He's a sick child who... I have recordings, Sarah interrupted, holding up her phone. 3 weeks worth. Video, audio, photographs. Everything. Richard's eyes met Sarah's, and she saw something shift in his expression. The grief-numbed father was disappearing, replaced by a man who had built a tech empire through strategic thinking and decisive action. "Victoria," he said, his voice carrying the authority that made board members tremble, "I think we need to talk. Privately." "Richard, surely you don't believe the word of some waitress over your own wife." Now, the single word cut through her protest like a blade. As Victoria reluctantly followed Richard from the room, Sarah moved to Michael's bedside and gently handed him his medical device. The relief on his face as his spasms began to ease nearly broke her heart. "Is Amelia safe?" he managed to ask. "We're going to make sure she is," Sarah promised, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Both of you are going to be safe now." But even as she said it, Sarah knew the real battle was just beginning. Victoria Palmer wasn't going down without a fight, and she had resources Sarah could barely imagine. What Sarah didn't expect was that her act of courage would do more than expose Victoria's cruelty. It would also kindle something she had never dared hope for again. Trust, connection, and possibly, despite the impossible circumstances, love. Because sometimes the most unexpected alliances are forged in the fires of protecting innocent lives. And sometimes, standing up for what's right puts you directly in the path of everything you never knew you needed. The question was, would they all survive what came next? The shouting from Richard's study could be heard 3 rooms away. Sarah stayed with Michael and Amelia in the children's sitting room, trying to distract them with a card game, while Victoria's voice rose to near hysteric levels behind the closed mahogany doors. "She's really angry," Amelia whispered, unconsciously touching the fading bruise on her arm where Victoria had grabbed her weeks earlier. "When she gets angry like this, she can't hurt you anymore," Sarah said firmly, though her own heart was racing. "Your father knows the truth now." Michael dealt another hand of Go Fish with careful precision, his motor skills requiring extra concentration for the simple task. What if Daddy doesn't believe us? What if she convinces him we're lying? The fear in his voice broke Sarah's heart. These children had been so conditioned to doubt their own worth that even with evidence on their side, they expected to be abandoned. "Your father loves you," Sarah said, though she wondered if Richard Palmer's grief had left him emotionally available enough to fight the battle his children needed him to fight. "He's going to protect you." Through the window, Sarah noticed a black sedan pulling up to the circular drive. 2 people in expensive suits emerged, Victoria's lawyer and her sister, Charlotte, who served as Victoria's primary enabler and co-conspirator in maintaining her public image. The cavalry had arrived. 20 minutes later, Richard appeared in the doorway of the sitting room, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled. His tie was loosened, his hair mussed, and there was something raw and vulnerable in his eyes that hadn't been there since his wife Claudia's death. "Kids," he said softly, "can you give me and Sarah a few minutes to talk?" Michael and Amelia exchanged worried glances, but obediently moved to the adjoining playroom, staying within earshot but giving the adults privacy. Richard closed the door and turned to face Sarah, and she was struck by how different he looked without his usual armor of grief and emotional distance. This was a man who had just had his world turned upside down. "I need to ask you something," he said, his voice hoarse from the confrontation with Victoria. "And I need you to be completely honest with me." Sarah nodded, her pulse quickening. "How long has this been going on?" The simple question carried the weight of a father's worst nightmare. Sarah pulled out her phone and opened the folder where she had been documenting Victoria's abuse. "Based on what I've witnessed directly, at least 3 weeks," she said quietly. "But based on the children's behavior patterns and some things they've said, I think it started almost immediately after you married her." Richard's face crumpled as he processed the implications. 2 years. My God, Sarah, for 2 years I've been failing them. "You didn't know," Sarah said gently. "Victoria is very skilled at manipulation. She made sure you only saw what she wanted you to see. But you saw through it." Richard looked at her with something approaching awe. "Within minutes of meeting them, you recognized what was happening." "How?" Sarah hesitated, then made a decision to trust him with her own painful truth. "Because I lived it. My adoptive parents, they were very good at appearing loving and devoted in public, while systematically destroying my self-worth in private. I recognized the signs because I survived them." Something shifted in Richard's expression as he absorbed this revelation. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. It's not about me, she said quickly, though his genuine empathy touched something deep inside her that had been frozen for years. It's about Michael and Amelia. They need you to fight for them now. Victoria is threatening to take half of everything in a divorce, Richard said, running his hands through his hair. Her lawyer is claiming I'm having an affair with you, that I'm mentally unstable from grief, that I'm fabricating evidence to justify throwing her out. She's already filed a restraining order claiming I threatened her. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Mr. Palmer. Richard, he corrected softly. After what you've done for my children, I think we're past formalities. The use of his first name sent an unexpected flutter through Sarah's chest, but she pushed the feeling aside. This wasn't the time for whatever was stirring between them. Richard, she said carefully, Victoria's sister just arrived with a lawyer. They're going to try to discredit me as a witness. A waitress with no legal training and a history of childhood trauma. I'm not exactly the most credible person to take on someone with Victoria's resources. You have evidence, Richard pointed out. Evidence that could be dismissed as doctored or taken out of context. And if Victoria is claiming we're having an affair, Sarah's voice trailed off as the implications hit her. She's going to destroy both our reputations to protect herself. Richard was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face with an intensity that made her breath catch. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and determined. Then we need to be smarter than she is. What do you mean? Victoria's greatest weapon is her ability to control the narrative. She's counting on my grief and guilt making me back down rather than fight a public battle. She's assuming you'll be intimidated by her lawyers and social connections. Sarah nodded, following his logic. But she's made one crucial mistake, Richard continued, moving closer to Sarah. She underestimated who she was dealing with. I didn't build a tech empire by backing down from battles just because they were difficult. And you, he paused, his eyes meeting hers. You've already proven you're brave enough to stand up to her when innocent lives are at stake. The admiration in his voice sent warmth spreading through Sarah's chest, but it was mixed with fear. Richard, if we do this, if we really fight her, there's no going back. She'll use every dirty trick she can think of. Then we'd better make sure we're prepared for all of them. From the study came the sound of voices rising again, and through the window, Sarah saw another car arriving. This one carrying a man with a briefcase and the predatory look of an expensive private investigator. She's not wasting any time, Sarah observed. Neither should we. Richard pulled out his phone. I'm calling my lawyer and my head of security. If Victoria wants to play hardball, she's about to learn that I've been playing in much bigger leagues than she realized. As Richard made his calls, Sarah found herself watching him with new eyes. The grieving widower was disappearing, replaced by the strategic businessman who had dominated his industry. But more than that, she was seeing glimpses of the loving father he had been before grief had numbed him to his children's needs. When he finished his calls, he turned back to Sarah with renewed determination. I want you to know, he said quietly, that I'm going to make sure Victoria never hurts my children again. But I also want you to know that by standing up for them, you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. What's that? Hope. His eyes met hers, and Sarah felt something electric pass between them, and the reminder that there are still people in this world worth fighting for. The moment was interrupted by Amelia's voice from the playroom. Daddy? The mean lawyer lady is at the front door, and she's asking for Sarah. Richard and Sarah exchanged grim looks. The real battle was about to begin. But as they prepared to face Victoria's legal assault together, Sarah realized something that both terrified and exhilarated her. She was no longer fighting just to protect two innocent children. She was fighting to protect the family she had never dared hope she could be part of. And the man standing beside her, brilliant, determined, and finally awakening to his role as both father and protector, was beginning to feel like something she had never expected to find again. Home. The question now was whether their growing connection would be strong enough to survive the storm Victoria was about to unleash. Because if they thought the abuse had been bad, Victoria's revenge was going to be absolutely ruthless. And she was just getting started. The deposition was scheduled for the following Monday in Victoria's lawyer's downtown office, a power play designed to intimidate. But as Sarah sat across from the mahogany conference table, facing Victoria's legal team, she felt surprisingly calm. Richard's hand briefly touched her shoulder as he took his seat beside her, and that simple contact gave her strength. What none of them expected was the revelation that would emerge from Victoria's own arrogance. Mrs. Washington, Victoria's lawyer, a sharp-featured woman named Patricia Thornton, began with a predatory smile. "You claim to have witnessed my client engaging in inappropriate behavior toward her stepchildren. But isn't it true that you have a history of making false accusations against authority figures?" Sarah's lawyer, David Chun, one of Atlanta's top family law attorneys whom Richard had flown in from New York, objected smoothly. "Relevance, counselor. It goes to credibility," Thornton replied. "Mrs. Washington has a documented history of behavioral problems in her previous employment." Sarah felt her stomach drop. She had been fired from 2 previous catering positions, once for insubordination, when she had questioned why the black staff were paid less than their white counterparts, and once for inappropriate conduct, when she had reported a chef for sexually harassing the younger waitresses. But Richard leaned forward, his voice cutting through the room like steel. "Actually, Ms. Thornton, I think we should discuss documented histories. Would you like to explain why your client has been through 3 nannies in the past 2 years? Victoria's composure flickered. The nannies were incompetent. Were they? Richard's security chief, Marcus Rodriguez, opened a folder and slid photographs across the table. "Because according to our investigation, all 3 filed complaints with their agencies about Mrs. Palmer's treatment of the children. Complaints that were mysteriously withdrawn after your client made certain financial arrangements." Sarah watched Victoria's face pale as the implication sank in. The nannies had seen the abuse too, but Victoria had bought their silence. "This is preposterous," Victoria snapped. "You can't prove." "Actually, we can." Richard's voice was deadly quiet. "Because one of the nannies, Maria Santos, kept copies of everything, including recordings she made to protect herself in case you try to blame her for the children's injuries." The room fell silent. Victoria's lawyer was frantically whispering in her client's ear, but Victoria seemed frozen, staring at the photographs spread across the table. Images that clearly showed bruises on both children during the nanny's employment. But the biggest shock was yet to come. "There's something else," Richard continued, his eyes never leaving Victoria's face. "Something we discovered when we ran a more thorough background check on you, Victoria. Something your expensive lawyers apparently missed during our prenuptial negotiations." Victoria's green eyes flashed with panic. "Richard, whatever lies you think you've uncovered. Your first marriage." Richard's words fell like stones into still water. "To David Morrison. The marriage ended when Child Services removed his daughter from your care after she was hospitalized with suspicious injuries." The air in the room seemed to crystallize. Sarah felt her breath catch as she realized what Richard was revealing. "That's sealed," Victoria whispered, her carefully constructed facade crumbling completely. "Sealed juvenile record can be unsealed when there's evidence of ongoing child endangerment," David Chun said smoothly, "which we now have abundant proof of." Victoria's lawyer was frantically gathering papers, clearly blindsided by this revelation. "My client was never charged. Because David Morrison paid a substantial settlement to avoid criminal charges," Richard continued relentlessly. "But the social worker's reports are quite detailed. Victoria has a documented pattern of targeting vulnerable children in her care. Children with disabilities. Children who couldn't easily report the abuse." Sarah stared at Victoria in horror, finally understanding the calculated nature of her cruelty. This wasn't just a woman who resented her stepchildren. This was a predator who had specifically chosen Richard because his children were vulnerable targets. "You researched us," Sarah said, the pieces falling into place. "After Claudia died, you researched Richard and the children. You knew Michael had cerebral palsy, knew Amelia had hearing difficulties. You specifically targeted this family." Victoria's mask finally shattered completely. The poised socialite disappeared, replaced by something cold and vicious. "Those children were supposed to make me look maternal and caring," she snarled. "The grieving widower and his disabled children. It was the perfect sob story for Atlanta's social circuit. But instead, they're nothing but ungrateful little burdens who—" "Stop talking." Her lawyer's sharp command cut through Victoria's rant, but it was too late. The room's recording equipment had captured every word. Richard stood slowly, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Get out of my house. Get out of my children's lives. And if you ever come near my family again, I will use every resource at my disposal to destroy you. You can't just, Victoria began. Actually, I can. Richard's voice carried the authority of someone who had built an empire through strategic warfare. The prenup you sign becomes null and void in cases of child endangerment. You'll leave with exactly what you brought into this marriage. Nothing. And considering the evidence we now have of your pattern of child abuse, you'll be lucky if you avoid criminal charges. As Victoria and her legal team scrambled to leave, Sarah found herself shaking with a mixture of relief and residual terror. They had won this battle, but the cost of the revelation was staggering. When the room finally cleared, Richard turned to Sarah with eyes that held both gratitude and something deeper. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Sarah nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure. "The children, they need to know they're safe now." "They will be." Richard moved closer, and Sarah could see the exhaustion and relief warring in his expression. "But right now, I need to say something to you." Sarah's heart began to race as Richard stepped into her personal space, his hand reaching up to gently touch her cheek. "What you did," he said quietly, "standing up for my children when I was too blind to see what was happening. Sarah, you saved them. You saved all of us." The gratitude in his voice was overwhelming, but it was the tenderness in his eyes that made Sarah's breath catch. "Richard," she whispered, aware that they were crossing a line that would change everything between them. "I know this is complicated," he said, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "I know we come from different worlds, and I know the timing is terrible. But Sarah, what I'm feeling for you, it's not gratitude. It's not a rebound emotion from the crisis. It's something real, and it's something I thought I'd never feel again after losing Claudia." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. After years of believing she was unworthy of love, after surviving her adoptive family's systematic destruction of her self-worth, here was a man who saw her courage, her compassion, her strength. "I feel it too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But Richard, your children have been through so much trauma. They need stability, not more upheaval. They love you already." Richard interrupted gently. "Did you know that? Michael told me you're the first person besides his mother who ever made him feel normal. And Amelia asked me if you could stay forever." The revelation made Sarah's heart soar and break simultaneously. These children, who had every reason to fear trusting adults, had opened their hearts to her. "I don't want to leave them," Sarah admitted. "I don't want to leave any of you." Richard's smile was like the sunrise after the longest night. "Then don't." As he leaned down to kiss her, Sarah realized that sometimes the most beautiful love stories emerge from the darkest circumstances. Sometimes protecting innocent lives leads you to discover the family you never knew you needed. But even as Richard's lips met hers in a kiss that tasted like hope and new beginnings, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Victoria Palmer wasn't finished with them yet. And she was right to be worried, because a woman who had built her life on manipulation and control didn't surrender easily. Victoria's final gambit was going to be her most dangerous yet, and it would test whether the love growing between Sarah and Richard was strong enough to survive when everything they cared about was on the line. Hope you're loving this story as much as I am. If you are, please let me know in the comments below. Your encouragement means the world to me. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that celebrate the power of love, overcoming even the darkest circumstances. The kidnapping happened on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after Victoria had been served with divorce papers and a restraining order. Sarah was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard Amelia's scream cut through the morning air like a blade. By the time she reached the front yard, Victoria's sister Charlotte was already speeding away in a black SUV with tinted windows. Amelia stood on the front steps, tears streaming down her face, her small hands pressed against the glass door. "They took Michael," she sobbed. "Aunt Charlotte said they were taking him somewhere safe, but he was scared. Sarah, he was so scared." Richard burst through the front door, still in his pajamas, his phone already pressed to his ear as he called 911. But Sarah knew that by the time the police responded, Victoria's carefully planned revenge would already be in motion. "Where would they take him?" Sarah asked Amelia gently, kneeling down to the child's eye level despite her own panic. "I don't know. Charlotte said something about Daddy not being fit to take care of special needs children. She said Michael would be better off in a place with people who understand him." Sarah's blood ran cold. A facility? Richard finished his call and immediately pulled Sarah aside, his face ashen. Victoria filed emergency custody papers claiming I'm mentally unstable and that Michael is being neglected due to his medical needs. She has a judge, probably one she's paid off, ready to sign a temporary custody order. She can't do that, Sarah said desperately. We have evidence of her abuse. Evidence that her lawyers are claiming was fabricated by my unstable girlfriend to help me get rid of my inconvenient wife. Richard's hands shook as he ran them through his hair. Sarah, they're painting you as my accomplice in a conspiracy to frame Victoria. The full horror of Victoria's plan became clear. She couldn't regain custody of both children, but she could take Michael, the more vulnerable child whose medical needs would make him harder for Richard to protect in a custody battle. And by framing Sarah as Richard's co-conspirator, she was destroying their credibility as witnesses. There's more, Richard continued, his voice breaking. Victoria is claiming that our relationship proves I'm using the children's trauma to manipulate women into inappropriate relationships. She's saying I coach you to seduce me, and that we've been having an affair since before I discovered the supposed abuse. Sarah felt the world tilting around her. Richard, if being with me is going to cost you your children. No. His voice was fierce, desperate. Don't you dare blame yourself for her evil. But the damage was already spreading. Richard's phone rang constantly. Reporters who had somehow gotten hold of the story, board members concerned about the scandal affecting Palmer Industries, and worst of all, child services agents who wanted to investigate Amelia's living situation. By noon, a social worker named Janet Mitchell was sitting in their living room, taking notes as Amelia huddled against Sarah's side. Mr. Palmer, Mitchell said coldly, I have to say, the timing of your romantic relationship with Ms. Washington is quite concerning. Beginning a sexual relationship with an employee while your children were allegedly being abused suggests some serious lapses in judgment. My relationship with Sarah began after she protected my children, Richard said through gritted teeth. She's the reason I discovered what Victoria was doing. According to Mrs. Palmer's testimony, Ms. Washington was already living in your home inappropriately before any supposed abuse was reported. She claims Ms. Washington seduced you as part of a plan to get access to your wealth, and that the abuse allegations are fabricated to justify removing your wife from the picture. Sarah felt her heart breaking as she watched Richard realize the impossible position Victoria had put them in. Every piece of evidence they had could now be dismissed as part of their supposed conspiracy. Where is Michael now? Richard demanded. He's been placed in a secure facility for special needs children while the custody evaluation takes place. I'm not authorized to reveal the location. Amelia's grip on Sarah's hand tightened. When can Daddy see him? Mitchell's expression softened slightly when she looked at the little girl. That depends on the evaluation results. Right now, there are supervised visits scheduled twice a week. After Mitchell left, Richard collapsed onto the couch beside Sarah and Amelia, looking more defeated than she had ever seen him. She won, he said quietly. Victoria actually won. She has Michael. She's destroyed our credibility. And now they're going to take Amelia too, because they think I'm an unfit father who's more concerned with my love life than my children's welfare. Sarah's heart shattered as she realized the terrible truth. Victoria had been right about one thing. Sarah's presence in Richard's life was being used as a weapon against him and his children. Richard, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. I have to leave. What? His head snapped up in panic. Don't you see? As long as I'm here, Victoria can use our relationship to discredit everything. She can claim you're prioritizing romance over your children's needs. But if I leave, if I disappear from your life completely, you can focus entirely on getting Michael back. Sarah, no. I won't lose you too. You have to. Sarah stood up, gently disengaging from Amelia's grip. Your children need you to be completely focused on them right now. They can't afford to have their father distracted by a relationship that Victoria is using to destroy your family. Amelia looked up at Sarah with terrified eyes. You're leaving us too? The question was like a knife to Sarah's heart. But she forced herself to smile, to be strong for this little girl who had already lost too much. I'm not leaving because I don't love you, Sarah said gently. I'm leaving because I love you so much that I want your daddy to get Michael back. And I want you both to be safe and happy. Sometimes loving someone means making the hardest choice. Richard stood up, his face a mask of anguish. There has to be another way. There isn't. Sarah picked up her purse, knowing that if she stayed even another minute, she wouldn't have the strength to leave. Fight for them, Richard. Fight with everything you have. And don't let Victoria win. As Sarah walked toward the door, Amelia's voice stopped her. Will you come back when Michael comes home? Sarah turned around, memorizing the faces of the two people who had become her whole world in such a short time. Richard's eyes were pleading with her to stay, to fight with him, to believe that love could conquer even this. But Sarah had learned long ago that sometimes love meant sacrifice. Sometimes protecting the people you care about meant walking away from them. I'll always love you, she told Amelia. Both of you. Remember that. And then she walked out the door, leaving behind the only family she had ever chosen, the only man who had ever seen her worth, and the children who had given her purpose. As she drove away from the Palmer mansion, Sarah told herself she was doing the right thing. That removing herself from the equation would give Richard the best chance of getting Michael back and keeping Amelia safe. But deep down, she feared that Victoria's final gambit had succeeded beyond even her wildest expectations. She hadn't just separated Michael from his family. She had destroyed the growing bond between Richard and Sarah, leaving everyone isolated and vulnerable. And somewhere in a facility across town, an 8-year-old boy with cerebral palsy was crying for his family, not understanding why the people he loved had abandoned him to strangers. Victoria Palmer had played her hand perfectly. She might not get what she originally wanted, but she had ensured that everyone else lost everything that mattered to them. The question now was whether love could survive this ultimate test, or if Victoria's cruelty had finally won the war. 3 days after Sarah left, Richard sat in his lawyer's office staring at a custody evaluation report that painted him as an emotionally unstable widower who had prioritized a romantic relationship over his children's well-being. The supervised visits with Michael had been heartbreaking. His son kept asking where Sarah was, why she wasn't coming to see him, and when he could come home. Richard had no answers, only the hollow ache of having lost everything that mattered to him. That's when David Chin walked into the conference room with an expression that Richard hadn't seen since they'd first uncovered Victoria's history of abuse. Hope. We found her, David announced, dropping a thick folder on the mahogany table. Found who? Maria Santos. The first nanny Victoria paid off. The one who kept copies of everything. Richard's pulse quickened. I thought she disappeared. She had. She was so terrified of Victoria that she moved back to her family in Guatemala. But our investigator finally tracked her down, and Richard. David's smile was fierce. She's ready to testify. About everything. Richard opened the folder and felt his breath catch. Photographs, medical records, audio recordings. A mountain of evidence documenting Victoria's systematic abuse, not just of Michael and Amelia, but of her previous stepchild as well. This is enough to destroy Victoria's credibility completely, David continued. But there's something else. Something that changes the entire game. David pulled out a single sheet of paper, a medical report dated 3 months before Victoria married Richard. Psychological evaluation, David explained. Court-ordered as part of Victoria's previous custody battle. The psychiatrist diagnosed her with narcissistic personality disorder with sociopathic tendencies. He specifically noted her pattern of targeting vulnerable children and recommended she never be granted unsupervised access to minors. Richard stared at the document, feeling a rage so pure it was almost cleansing. This existed the whole time. Victoria's lawyers buried it, sealed it as part of the settlement agreement. But Maria Santos had a copy. Victoria had shown it to her as a way of intimidating her into silence, bragging about how she'd beaten the system before and would do it again. Why is Maria willing to come forward now? David's expression grew solemn. Because she found out about Michael. She has a son with cerebral palsy, Richard. When she learned that Victoria was targeting another disabled child, she said she couldn't stay silent anymore, no matter the cost. For the first time in days, Richard felt something other than despair. What do? We filed an emergency motion to overturn the custody order. With this evidence, no judge, corrupt or otherwise, can ignore the truth about Victoria's pattern of child abuse. Richard was already reaching for his phone. I need to call Sarah. Richard, wait. David's tone was cautious. I know you care about her, but bringing her back now could undermine everything we've built. Victoria's lawyers will claim this proves your relationship was more important to you than. No. Richard's voice carried the authority that had built his empire. Sarah didn't leave because she stopped caring. She left because she was willing to sacrifice her own happiness to protect my children. That's not the action of someone with selfish motives. That's the action of someone who loves my family more than she loves herself. Richard dialed Sarah's number, his heart pounding as it rang once, twice, 3 times. Hello. Her voice was hoarse, as if she'd been crying. Sarah, we found the evidence. We need to get Michael back. Silence stretched between them, and Richard could hear her sharp intake of breath. That's wonderful, Richard. I'm so happy for you. I need you to come back. Richard, we talked about this. Maria Santos is testifying. She has medical records proving Victoria has a documented history of targeting disabled children. The custody order is going to be overturned, and when it is, I want my family to be complete. Your family is you and your children. My family, Richard interrupted fiercely, is me, Michael, Amelia, and the woman who was brave enough to protect them when I failed to. Sarah, my children need you. I need you. Come home. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. What if Victoria's lawyers? Let them try to discredit the love we have for each other. Let them try to argue that a woman who was willing to walk away from everything she cared about to protect 2 children was acting out of selfish motives. The truth is stronger than Victoria's lies, Sarah. And the truth is that you're the best thing that's happened to my family since Claudia died. The comparison to his late wife was deliberate. Richard needed Sarah to understand that what he felt for her wasn't diminished by his love for Claudia, but enhanced by it. Claudia would have loved Sarah for protecting their children. I'm scared, Sarah admitted. So am I, Richard said honestly. But I'm more scared of living without you, of raising my children without the woman who taught them they were worth protecting. Sarah, you showed me how to be a father again. You showed Michael and Amelia what it means to be loved unconditionally. Don't let Victoria's cruelty take that away from us. Through the phone, Richard could hear Sarah crying. The hearing is tomorrow morning, he continued gently. Whether you come back or not, Michael will be home by tomorrow night. But Sarah, he's going to ask for you. And so is Amelia. And so am I, every day for the rest of my life if necessary. Richard, I love you, he said, putting everything he felt into those 3 words. Not because you saved my children, not because you stood up to Victoria, not because you were willing to sacrifice your own happiness for ours. I love you because of who you are, brave, compassionate, fierce, and beautiful inside and out. I love you because when I'm with you, I remember who I used to be before grief made me forget how to live. The silence stretched so long that Richard began to fear Sarah had hung up. Then, in a voice strong with newly discovered hope, I love you too, all of you. I'm coming home. As Richard ended the call, David was smiling broadly. Think she'll make it to the courthouse in time? She'll be there, Richard said with absolute certainty. Sarah Washington has never backed down from a fight when innocent lives were at stake. And tomorrow, we're going to remind everyone exactly who they're dealing with. Across town, Sarah was already packing her few belongings, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She had spent 3 days believing that walking away was the greatest act of love she could perform. But Richard was right. Love wasn't just about sacrifice. Sometimes love meant standing and fighting together, even when the odds seemed impossible. Tomorrow, they would face Victoria Palmer and her army of corrupt lawyers and paid-off officials. Tomorrow, they will fight for the right to be a family. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Sarah believed they might actually win. Because sometimes the darkest hour is just before dawn. Sometimes the moment when everything seems lost is exactly when love finds its greatest strength. Tomorrow, the Palmer family was going to be whole again, and Sarah Washington was finally going home. The Fulton County Courthouse was packed with reporters and spectators when Sarah walked through the doors at 8:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the emergency custody hearing was scheduled to begin. She spotted Richard immediately. He was standing near the front of the courtroom with David Shunn, his posture radiating the controlled intensity that had made him one of Atlanta's most formidable businessmen. When he saw her, his entire face transformed. The exhaustion and worry that had marked his features for days melted away, replaced by something that looked like relief mixed with pure joy. Sarah made her way through the crowd, Ignoring the whispers and camera flashes, her eyes locked on Richard's. When she reached him, he pulled her into his arms without hesitation, holding her like he was afraid she might disappear again. "You came," he whispered against her hair. "I told you I was coming home," she whispered back. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Williams," the bailiff announced. As they took their seats, Sarah caught sight of Victoria across the aisle. Gone was the polished socialite facade. Victoria looked haggard, her blonde hair pulled back severely, her green eyes darting nervously around the courtroom. Her legal team looked equally tense, shuffling through papers with the frantic energy of people who knew they were fighting a losing battle. Judge Williams, a stern-looking black woman in her 50s, called the court to order and immediately addressed the elephant in the room. "I've reviewed the emergency motion filed by Mr. Palmer's legal team," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of years on the family court bench. "The evidence presented is extensive and deeply disturbing." David Shin stood smoothly. "Your Honor, we have additional testimony from Maria Santos, who was employed as a nanny by Mrs. Palmer during her previous marriage. Ms. Santos has documentation going back 3 years that establishes a clear pattern of child endangerment." Victoria's lawyer, Patricia Thornton, shot to her feet. "Your Honor, this is a desperate attempt by Mr. Palmer to introduce hearsay evidence from a disgruntled employee who—" "Ms. Thornton," Judge Williams interrupted coldly, "I suggest you save your objections until you've heard the testimony. Bailiff, please escort Ms. Santos to the witness stand." Sarah watched as Maria Santos entered the courtroom, a slight woman in her 30s with tired eyes and calloused hands that spoke of years of hard work. When she raised her right hand to be sworn in, Sarah noticed her hands were trembling. "Ms. Santos," David Shun began gently, "can you tell the court about your employment with Victoria Palmer during her marriage to David Morrison?" Maria's accented English was soft but clear. "I worked for Mrs. Palmer for 8 months, taking care of her stepdaughter Emma, who had autism. At first, everything seemed normal, but then I started noticing." Maria paused, gathering her courage. "I started noticing that Emma would have injuries when Mrs. Palmer was alone with her. Bruises on her arms where she had been grabbed. Once, a black eye that Mrs. Palmer said was from Emma having a meltdown and hitting herself. Did you believe Mrs. Palmer's explanations?" "At first, yes, but then I saw it happen." Maria's voice grew stronger. "Mrs. Palmer grabbed Emma and shook her because she spilled juice on a white couch. She shook her so hard that Emma's head snapped back, and then she told Emma that if she told anyone what happened, she would send her away to live with strangers." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Sarah felt Richard's hand tighten around hers. "What did you do?" David asked. "I started keeping records. Pictures of Emma's injuries. Audio recordings of Mrs. Palmer yelling at her, calling her a broken little freak who ruined everything." Maria's voice broke slightly. "I have a son with special needs, Mr. Chun. I know what real accidents look like, and I know what abuse looks like. This was abuse." David introduced the evidence methodically. Photographs that made the courtroom gallery gasp, audio recordings that reduced several spectators to tears, and most damning of all, the psychological evaluation that Victoria had tried to bury. "Mrs. Palmer," Judge Williams said when it came time for cross-examination, "your attorney may question this witness, but I'll warn you now that this court has zero tolerance for intimidation tactics." Patricia Thornton approached Maria with the caution of someone walking through a minefield. "Ms. Santos, isn't it true that you were paid a substantial sum by Mr. Palmer to testify today?" "No," Maria replied firmly. "Mr. Palmer offered to pay my travel expenses from Guatemala, but I refused. I came here because I couldn't live with myself knowing another child was suffering the way Emma suffered." "But you did accept payment from Mrs. Palmer 3 years ago to keep quiet about these alleged incidents." Maria's face flushed with shame. "Yes. Mrs. Palmer gave me $10,000 and told me that if I ever spoke about what I saw, she would have me deported and make sure I never saw my son again. I was scared, so I took the money and kept quiet." "What changed?" Thornton pressed. "I found out she was doing it again. To Michael Palmer, a little boy with cerebral palsy who couldn't defend himself." Maria turned to look directly at Victoria, her voice gaining power. "I realized that my silence made me part of hurting innocent children. I won't be part of that anymore." The cross-examination crumbled from there. Every attack Thornton made on Maria's credibility only highlighted the courage it had taken for her to come forward. When it was Victoria's turn to testify, Judge Williams fixed her with a stare that could have melted steel. "Mrs. Palmer, I've seen a lot of custody cases in my 20 years on this bench, but I've rarely encountered evidence this comprehensive or damning. Before we proceed, I want to give you one opportunity to explain yourself." Victoria stood, her composure finally cracking completely. "Your Honor, this is all lies. Maria Santos was a disgruntled employee, and Richard Palmer is a grieving widower who's being manipulated by his girlfriend into believing." "Stop." Judge Williams's voice cut through Victoria's protests like a blade. "Mrs. Palmer, I have audio recordings of you threatening these children. I have photographs of injuries you inflicted. I have testimony from multiple witnesses establishing a pattern of abuse spanning years. What I don't have is any evidence supporting your claims of conspiracy." Victoria's face went white. "You have to understand, those children are difficult. Michael's condition requires constant attention, and Amelia is always causing trouble. I was trying to teach them discipline. You were systematically abusing vulnerable children," Judge Williams said, her voice rising for the first time. "And according to this psychological evaluation, you specifically target children with disabilities because you believe they make easier victims." The courtroom was dead silent as Judge Williams shuffled through her papers with deliberate precision. "Mrs. Palmer, I am immediately overturning the temporary custody order and returning full custody of Michael Palmer to his father. Furthermore, I am ordering a complete psychological evaluation of your fitness as a guardian for any child, and I am referring this case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges." Victoria's legs gave out, and she collapsed in her chair as her lawyer frantically tried to calm her down. "Mr. Palmer," Judge Williams continued, her tone softening slightly, "your son will be returned to you within the hour. I apologize that this court was initially misled by fraudulent claims. Your children are lucky to have a father who fought so hard for them." Judge Williams paused, her eyes finding Sarah in the gallery. "And they're lucky to have someone like Ms. Washington in their lives, someone willing to put their welfare above her own interests." As the gavel fell, Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. Around them, the courtroom erupted in chaos, reporters shouting questions, Victoria screaming at her lawyers, and the sound of camera shutters clicking rapidly. But Sarah only had eyes for Richard, who was holding her face in his hands with an expression of pure love and gratitude. "We did it," he whispered. "We actually did it. Will we get Michael back? We get Michael back. We get our family back. We get everything, Sarah." As they kissed in the middle of the courthouse, Sarah realized that sometimes justice really did prevail. Sometimes love really was stronger than cruelty. Sometimes the people who deserved to win actually did. And sometimes the family you choose becomes the family you were always meant to have. In 2 hours, Michael Palmer would be home where he belonged. In 2 hours, Amelia would have her brother back and the woman she had come to love as a second mother. And Victoria Palmer, the woman who had built her life on targeting innocent children, would finally face the consequences of her cruelty. But right now, in this moment, Sarah Washington was exactly where she belonged, in Richard Palmer's arms, surrounded by people who believed that love was worth fighting for, about to go home to the children who had made her heart whole. The battle was over. Love had won, and their real life together was just beginning. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the kitchen of the Palmer mansion, now truly her home, watching through the window as Richard pushed Michael's wheelchair through the garden while Amelia ran circles around them, her hearing aids catching the afternoon sunlight. The sound of their laughter drifted through the open windows like music. Michael had come so far since that terrible day when Victoria had taken him. The trauma had left its marks, nightmares that still woke him some nights, a lingering fear when adults raised their voices. But with consistent love, therapy, and the security of knowing he was safe, he was healing. His speech had improved dramatically, and just last week he had started calling Sarah, Mama Sarah, without any prompting from his father. Amelia had blossomed too, no longer the frightened, withdrawn child who flinched at sudden movements. She had become vibrant and confident, her personality shining through in ways that reminded Sarah so much of the little girl's late mother. She had started a blog about living with hearing loss, inspired by Sarah's stories about overcoming childhood trauma, and her posts were already inspiring other children facing similar challenges. "You're thinking too hard again." Richard's voice came from behind her as his arms wrapped around her waist. Sarah leaned back against his chest, marveling at how natural this felt, how completely she belonged in his embrace. "Just remembering," she said softly. "Good memories or bad ones?" "Both, but mostly good." Sarah turned in his arms to face him. "Richard, sometimes I can't believe this is real, that we made it through everything Victoria threw at us." Richard's expression grew serious. "Have you heard the latest news about her?" Sarah nodded. Victoria had been sentenced to 5 years in prison for child endangerment and fraud. Her previous victims, including Emma Morrison and 2 other children for relationships Richard's investigator had uncovered, had finally come forward, their testimonies ensuring Victoria would never again have the opportunity to hurt innocent children. "Good," Sarah said simply. "She can't hurt anyone else now." "Michael asked me something yesterday," Richard said, his hands gently cupping Sarah's face. "He wanted to know when you were going to become his official mom, not just his mom as Sarah." Sarah's heart skipped. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that was up to you." Richard's voice was soft, vulnerable in a way that still took her breath away. "Sarah Washington, you saved my children. You saved me. You brought love back into this house when I thought I'd lost it forever. Will you marry me?" Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes as Richard dropped to one knee, pulling out a ring box that held the most beautiful diamond she'd ever seen. Not ostentatious or flashy, but elegant and timeless, like something meant to last forever. "Richard, before you answer," he continued, "I need you to know that this isn't about gratitude or convenience or making things easier for the custody arrangements. This is about the fact that I love you completely, deeply, and forever. I love your courage, your compassion, your strength. I love how you make Michael laugh and how you braid Amelia's hair while she tells you about her day. I love how you've made us a family again." Through the window, Sarah could see the children had stopped playing and were watching through the glass, their faces pressed against the panes with excitement. "They already know, don't they?" Sarah laughed through her tears. "Amelia picked out the ring," Richard admitted sheepishly. "And Michael has been practicing his best man speech for weeks." "Yes," Sarah said, not even caring that the word came out as a sob. "Yes, Richard, of course yes." As Richard slipped the ring on her finger, the children burst through the patio doors, cheering and jumping and filling the kitchen with the kind of joyful chaos that Sarah had learned was the sound of a happy home. "Are you really going to be our mom now?" Amelia asked, throwing her arms around Sarah's waist. "If you'll have me," Sarah said, kneeling down to meet both children at eye level. "We've been waiting forever," Michael said, his words clear and strong. "Daddy loves you, and we love you, and now we get to be a real family." "We already were a real family," Sarah told him gently. "Love makes a family, not papers or ceremonies. But now we get to make it official." That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, the same table where Sarah had first witnessed Victoria's cruelty months earlier, Sarah marveled at how completely their lives had transformed. The formal dining room had been converted into a family space, with Michael's art projects covering one wall and Amelia's books scattered across the sideboard. "I have some news to share," Richard announced as they finished dessert. "Sarah, remember how you always said you wanted to do more than just serve meals?" Sarah nodded, curious where this was going. "I've been talking to the board at Palmer Industries. We're starting a new foundation, the Claudia Palmer Foundation for Child Protection. It will fund programs for abused children and train professionals to recognize the signs of abuse. And I'd like you to be the executive director." Sarah's fork clattered to her plate. "Richard, I don't have the qualifications." "You have something better than qualifications," he said firmly. "You have experience, compassion, and the courage to act when children need protection. You're exactly what this foundation needs. Plus," Amelia added with 8-year-old practicality, "you'll get to help other kids like Maria helped us." Maria Santos had indeed become a hero to the Palmer family. After her courageous testimony, Richard had helped her bring her son to Atlanta and had given her a position managing the household staff, a role she performed with the dedication of someone who understood the value of protecting children. "I can't think of anyone I'd trust more with Claudia's legacy," Richard said softly, and Sarah knew he was giving her the highest honor possible. connecting her to his late wife's memory in a way that honored both women. 3 months later, Sarah Catherine Washington became Sarah Catherine Palmer in a ceremony held in the garden where she had first watched Richard play with his children. Maria Santos served as her maid of honor, while Michael and Amelia stood proudly as best man and flower girl. Judge Patricia Williams, who had officiated the ceremony as a personal favor, concluded with words that brought tears to everyone's eyes. Love that is forged in the fires of protecting innocent lives burns brightest and longest. May this family continue to be a beacon of hope for children everywhere. As they danced their first dance as husband and wife, Sarah looked around at their guests, colleagues from Palmer Industries, families they had helped through the foundation, survivors of childhood abuse who had become advocates, and most importantly, Michael and Amelia, who were dancing together nearby, with joy radiating from their faces. Any regrets? Richard whispered in her ear. Sarah thought about her journey, from the scared, scarred woman who had walked into this house months ago to the confident wife, mother, and advocate she had become. She thought about the children they had already helped through the foundation, the legislation they were working to pass, and the family they had built from the ashes of tragedy. Only one, she said with a smile. What's that? I wish I could tell my 5-year-old self that someday someone would love her enough to choose her as family, that she would matter to people who saw her worth. Richard's arms tightened around her. You've always mattered, Sarah. You just finally found people worthy of seeing how extraordinary you are. Later that night, as they tucked Michael and Amelia into bed, Amelia asked the question that had become part of their nightly routine. Tell us the story about how our family came together. Sarah settled into the chair between their beds, Richard standing behind her with his hands on her shoulders, and began the story they all loved to hear. Once upon a time, there was a brave waitress who heard children crying and decided that she couldn't walk away. But tonight, for the first time, she changed the ending, and they all lived happily, safely, and lovingly ever after. The end. That's not the end, Michael protested sleepily. That's just the beginning of all our new adventures. And he was right. Sarah Palmer, wife, mother, advocate, and survivor, looked around at her family and realized that Michael had learned the most important lesson of all. Every ending that comes from love is really just a new beginning in disguise. As she turned off the lights and headed to the master bedroom she now shared with the man who had taught her that love could heal even the deepest wounds, Sarah smiled at the thought of all the adventures still waiting for them. Because sometimes fairy tales do come true. Sometimes the people who deserve happy endings actually get them. And sometimes the act of protecting innocent lives leads you to discover that you were worthy of protection and love all along. The Palmer family was complete, justice had been served, and love had triumphed over cruelty in the most beautiful way possible. And if you believe, like I do, that love always finds a way to win, please share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that subscribe button for more stories that celebrate the power of courage, compassion, and the families we choose. Because in a world that can sometimes feel dark, we all need reminders that heroes still exist. And sometimes, they look exactly like a waitress who refused to let innocent children suffer in silence. Until next time, keep believing in the power of love to change everything. Thanks for sticking with this story till the very end. But trust me, you haven't seen anything yet. The next story is crazier, more shocking, and will blow your mind. Click the image on your screen now and dive right in. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a single twist.